"You're coming with me," said Rancher
Thank
after
you,
her
sir.
in-laws took off
It
all her
hurts.
clothes. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Elias Mercer measured his days not by clocks or seasons, but by the quiet stretches between sunrise and nightfall. 12 years had slipped past since Clara's burial, each one carrying the same shape. Solitude carved deep into the bones of a man who had already outlived too much. Most mornings began alike. A fire coaxed to life with dry cedar, coffee simmered in a blackened pot. The battered tin mug, its rim dented from some forgotten fall, felt as familiar in his hand as the scar etched across his thigh. He took his place on the porch, its boards weathered gray by sun and wind, facing away from town with deliberate intent. Out there, across the land, no eyes judged, no voices asked after the past. The New Mexico sky was still pale when the sun crested the eastern ridge. Its light spilled long and golden across the hard ground, catching on fence posts and the rough timbers of his cabin. The land was plain and unyielding, 40 acres of stubborn soil that yielded little but dust and work.
That suited Elias well. He had come here to bury noise, to live in the hush of routine. He lifted the mug, savoring the bitter steam, when the silence broke. At first it was faint, carried by the wind so thin he nearly mistook it for a hawk's cry. But then it came again, sharper, ragged with despair. A human voice, a woman's voice. The sound hung in the still morning like something foreign and unwelcome. Elias set the mug down on the railing. His movements, like all things he did these days, were steady and deliberate. He rose, slid the rifle into the crook of his arm, and followed the sound toward the creek. The path dipped low where spring floods once carved shallow banks. Cottonwoods leaned at the edges, their leaves whispering against the breeze. The water there ran clear, spilling over stones worn smooth with time. For a moment it seemed nothing had disturbed the familiar bend. Then he saw her, a figure curled near the base of a trunk, bare skin marked by bruises, feet bloodied from stone and thorn. She was not weeping. Her eyes, when they lifted to his, carried no tears, only the hollow resignation of someone who had endured cruelty long enough to expect no kindness.
Elias's jaw tightened. He looked away, granting her what little privacy could be salvaged. Slowly, he unfastened his coat, the faded blue jacket from his cavalry days, and laid it on a flat rock within her reach. "Cabin's just beyond that rise," he said, voice low and rough from disuse. "When you're ready." He turned his back, giving her the choice. Choice was perhaps the only dignity left to her. As he walked back toward his horse, the faint words of Clara's old Bible stirred unbidden in memory. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147:3. Some choices defined a man. Elias knew this one would define them both. An hour passed before he saw her again. Elias had returned to the cabin, stoked the fire, and cleared the small room that had stood unused since Clara's passing. Dust clung to every surface, but he laid out a dress, undergarments, and a brush, relics of another life, kept in a cedar chest too long closed. He left them outside the door, then withdrew to the porch. The sound of the latch turned softly. When she stepped across the threshold, she was swathed in his coat, her arms pulling it close as though it were armor. The hollow watchfulness in her eyes hadn't faded, yet there was a spark beneath it now, caution mixed with a will to stand. Elias gestured, keeping his distance. "Room's yours, clothes too, belong to my wife." The words felt strange, heavy with years of silence. "No questions, unless you offer answers." She gave the smallest nod, then disappeared inside. The door closed with a gentleness that carried more weight than a slam. He poured another cup of coffee, this one into Clara's mug, untouched since the day she died. He set it on the table beside a plate of cornbread and salt pork, then returned outside. He did not wait at the door, did not press. Hospitality was all he knew to give. Through the window he saw her at last, cleaner now, wearing the faded dress. It hung loose on her frame, but she held herself with a dignity that cloth could not take away. She approached the table cautiously, glancing toward the porch before sitting. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cup, but her gaze was steady. They ate in silence, fork scraping plate, fire crackling low, wind pressing at the shutters. Slowly, the quiet shifted from strained to bearable. When she finished, she looked up. Her voice, soft yet certain, filled the space between them. "Thank you. Thank you." 2 simple words. They startled Elias more than the scream by the creek had. He cleared his throat, uneasy with speech. Nothing owed. Her eyes lingered on him, measuring. Not gratitude alone, but a recognition that he had offered her choice instead of chains, space instead of demand. For a moment, he saw not the battered figure from the creek, but a woman still standing despite everything stripped away. Dusk fell, painting the land in copper light. Somewhere far off, coyotes called, their mournful song carrying across the desert. Elias leaned back in his chair, the weight of years pressing but not crushing. The land had demanded silence from him for so long. Now, in this fragile presence, he felt the faintest crack in that silence. He thought again of Clara's Bible, words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. He glanced toward the cabin. Perhaps the Lord had sent him this test or this mercy. Somewhere within those 4 walls, a stranger tried to piece herself back together. And for the first time in 12 long years, Elias wondered if he, too, might be mended. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The cabin had known only silence for years, its stillness broken now by the faint rhythms of another presence. Elias noticed first in small ways. The hearth, usually left to smolder, burned brighter, wood stacked neatly by the stone wall. The shelves, long buried in dust, bore the faint trace of a cloth wiping across them. Even the floorboards creaked differently beneath lighter footsteps than his own. He said nothing, but each change pressed against the walls he had built around his life. Rachel moved quietly, her work deliberate and without flourish. She did not rearrange or intrude, but restored what neglect had claimed. A pot simmered with something more palatable than the salt pork Elias lived on, and the smell, though modest, unsettled him. Comfort was not something he had expected to return. At the pump outside, Elias caught sight of her carrying water. The sleeves of Clara's old dress were rolled back, the hem brushing her bare feet as she balanced the bucket. Her movements carried both fatigue and resolve. She was not a guest, not exactly, and not yet a resident. She seemed instead like someone testing whether the ground beneath her could be called safe. He worked along the fence line that day, but his thoughts strayed more often than they should. For 12 years his routines had been untouched, smooth as ruts worn into a wagon road. Now, every action reminded him there was another heartbeat within reach. By evening, she had prepared a meal with the same quiet determination. Cornbread crisped at the edges, beans stewed gently over the fire. Elias sat across from her, unsure how to bridge the distance words would not cover. He cleared his throat once, twice, before finally saying, "You cook better than I do." Her eyes flicked up, guarded, then softened slightly. "Wasn't hard," she replied. Her voice carried the hoarseness of long silence, but it was steady. They ate in fragments of conversation, the space between sentences longer than the words themselves. She asked if the land always yielded so little. He answered that it gave what it wanted, no more. She nodded, as if she understood something deeper in the remark. When she cleared the plates, Elias caught himself watching her hands, scarred in places, nails broken, but steady in their work. They were not the hands of someone raised to idleness. There was strength there, tempered by hardship. Later, as he settled on the porch with his pipe, he heard her humming faintly and sighed. The melody was simple, unfamiliar, and yet it carried a weight that eased the edge of the day. He thought of Clara then, not with the piercing grief that had once hollowed him, but with a gentler ache, an echo that no longer demanded silence. Elias did not pray aloud, but the words came unbidden, remembered from Scripture Clara once underlined in faded ink. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. Psalm 34:19. He did not know if deliverance had come or if danger only drew nearer. But he knew this: the cabin was no longer empty, and that changed everything. The knock came heavy on the cabin door, a fist that carried more claim than courtesy. Elias had been mending tack at the table, but his hand stilled, listening. Few men rode this far without purpose, and none knocked like that without intent. He rose slowly, rifle within reach, and opened the door. 3 men sat their horses in the yard, dust rising from restless hooves. At their center rode Jeremiah Holt, gray-bearded, his eyes cold as flint. To his right, Samuel, broad-shouldered and quick with his hand near the holster. To the left, Ezekiel, younger, his gaze unsettled but no less sharp. "Mercer," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the authority of a man long accustomed to obedience. "You're keeping what belongs to my family." Elias stepped onto the porch, door closing behind him. "This is private land. Nothing here belongs to you." Jeremiah's mouth tightened. "My daughter-in-law does, Walter's widow. She's under family guardianship, by law and by right. You're harboring a runaway, and I aim to take her back." Elias's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained steady. "She's not stock to be claimed." Samuel leaned forward in his saddle, smirking. "You think she chose you? She don't know what she's doing. Always been touched in the head like her ma." The insult rang sharp against the morning stillness. Elias felt the weight of his rifle behind him, but he did not move toward it. "Law says a man decides who steps on his land, and I say she stays if she chooses." Behind him, the latch clicked. Rachel stepped onto the porch. She wore Clara's dress, the fabric loose but decent, her hair pulled back with trembling fingers. Her knuckles whitened against the doorframe, yet her face carried a resolve that silenced even Samuel's sneer. Jeremiah's eyes fixed on her. "Rachel, come down now. Enough foolishness. Family sorts family business." She did not answer, but she moved. Each step forward drew her beside Elias, the hem of her dress brushing the boards. She said nothing, no protest, no plea. She only stood there, shoulders squared, her body angled toward him rather than them. The choice was plain. For a long moment, the yard held its breath. Horses pawed the dirt, wind stirring dust, the silence louder than any shot. Jeremiah's jaw worked. "This isn't over, Mercer. You think one broken woman changes the order of things? We'll see what the judge says. We'll see what the sheriff says." Elias didn't blink. Maybe so, but out here, on this land, she stays because she chooses. Samuel spat into the dirt, glaring hard at Rachel before jerking his reins. Ezekiel looked away, shame flickering across his face. Jeremiah turned his horse with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Elias. The 3 rode off, dust trailing behind them, but the promise of their return lingered heavier than smoke. Elias exhaled once, steadying the churn beneath his calm. He glanced at Rachel. She had not moved, still standing firm at his side. In that silent stance, more was spoken than any vow could hold. News in a frontier town traveled faster than the mail coach, carried not by riders, but by glances, whispers, and the tilt of a shopkeeper's chin. By the time Elias rode into town for supplies, the silence that usually greeted him had thickened into something sharper. Inside Whitfield's general store, 4 men loitered near the stove, their talk hushed until he entered. Then their voices rose, deliberately, carelessly loud. Elias paid them no mind at first, but the words hung in the air like burrs. "Widow Holt ran off half-dressed, crazy as her mother was," one said, chuckling. "Family says she stole heirlooms, too," another added. "Reckon there's a reward for anyone turns her in." The words slid over Elias's back, but not without cutting. He carried his basket of eggs to the counter where Sarah Whitfield waited. Her hair was tied back, streaked with gray, her face lined more from determination than age. "Morning, Elias," she said, brisk as ever. Then, softer, "You've brought trouble with you this time." He placed the eggs down, his voice even. "Flour, coffee, cotton cloth." Her eyes narrowed slightly at the last request, but she didn't question it. Instead, she gathered the items, wrapping the cloth in brown paper. When she returned, her tone had shifted from business to warning. "The Holts were here yesterday," she murmured, keeping her back to the men by the stove. "Turned this place upside down, looking for her. They'll say anything to drag her back, and half the county's bound up in their pockets." Elias counted out coins, each clink on the counter deliberate. Law's got no place in it. She stays because she chooses. "That's not how Jeremiah Holt will tell it," Sarah replied, lowering her voice further. "Judge Crawford owes him money. Sheriff Grant's sister is married into their line. Careful where you step." Elias gave a single nod. He took the bundle and stepped out into the street, feeling eyes follow him as he mounted his horse. Across the way, Sheriff Grant leaned on the porch rail of his office, hat brim low, mustache hiding his mouth. His gaze met Elias's, unreadable, then shifted away. When Elias returned to the cabin, he found the fire stoked and the table cleared. Rachel stood by the stove, her hands busy though her shoulders remained tense. She didn't ask about town, and he didn't offer. Instead, he placed Sarah's parcel on the table. She untied the string, unfolded the cloth, and touched the fabric lightly, almost reverently. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, the first words she had offered in days beyond necessity. "Thank you." 2 syllables, simple as bread, yet they lodged deep. Elias cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the weight of them. "Sarah Whitfield thought you'd need it." Rachel looked at him then, truly looked, and he saw not just gratitude, but a fierce will fighting to surface. She was no longer the broken figure by the creek. Slowly, piece by piece, she was standing again. Elias turned away, busying himself with hanging his hat. But a thought pressed in despite himself. Perhaps silence was not meant to last forever. By the week's end, rumor had ripened into certainty for those who wanted to believe the worst. In town, Rachel's name was whispered as if she carried contagion. The widow who refused her duty. The unstable woman who spurned her family. Each telling grew darker, sharpened by Jeremiah Holt's hand and tongue. Elias heard it in the pauses when he entered the saloon, in the way conversations stumbled before resuming. He bore it as he always had, shoulders set, silence intact. But this time the gossip cut deeper, for it was not only his own reputation under the knife. Back at the cabin, Rachel worked the soil near the porch, testing it between her fingers, her expression thoughtful. Elias watched from a distance, uncertain whether she sought distraction or hope. It was then, as dusk gathered, that her words came unbidden. "Walter wasn't kind," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled in the dirt. "Sober, he was harsh. Drunk, he was worse. When he died, they said I should belong to Samuel, as if I were livestock passed from one stall to the next." Elias did not answer at once. The confession needed no reply. Instead, he crouched beside her, placing a small tin of last year's bean seeds on the ground. "So plant," he said, "let the land answer back." Her eyes met his, a flicker of strength behind the weariness. She took the tin without another word. The next day, Elias sought out Tomas Reyes. The blacksmith shop stood at the edge of town, where sparks flew bright against the anvil and iron rang like a hymn. Tomas was younger than Elias by a handful of years, his shoulders thick with labor, but his eyes sharp, educated. He greeted Elias with a nod that carried both respect and caution. "Been here and talk," Tomas said as he plunged a glowing bar into water, steam hissing. "About a woman stayin' at your place. Holt wants her back. Law might bend his way." Elias folded his arms. Law bends too easy in this county. Tomas set aside the iron and wiped his hands. "Rachel Holt deserves better. I've seen the bruises she carried into town before. Nobody spoke of it then. Fear does that to people." Elias's jaw tightened. She's not going back. The blacksmith studied him for a long moment, then nodded. From a shelf, he pulled down a worn Bible, its pages smudged by coal-dusted fingers. "The righteous may have many troubles," he said quietly, "but the Lord delivers him from them all." Elias recognized the verse, words he had turned over in his mind too often these past days. Thomas closed the book with a firm hand. "If you mean to stand against the Holts, you won't stand alone." When Elias left the forge, the air seemed heavier, as though the town itself listened. Trouble was no longer a shadow. It was a storm gathering, layer by layer, and soon it would break. The courthouse in Las Piedras was little more than a whitewashed hall with benches worn smooth by years of disputes. Yet that morning it felt like the center of the territory, every eye fixed on the case Jeremiah Holt had dragged into its walls. Rachel stood at the front beside Elias, her chin lifted, though the shawl around her shoulders trembled with each breath. Holt sat across the aisle, flanked by Samuel and Ezekiel. His face carried the smug certainty of a man who believed law was another tool in his hand. Judge Crawford entered, his robe creased, his eyes shadowed.
He owed Holt more than money. His last campaign had been bankrolled by cattle sold under Holt's brand. The gavel cracked against the desk. Case of guardianship petition, Jeremiah Holt against Rachel Holt. Jeremiah rose, voice thick with righteous indignation. "Your Honor, my daughter-in-law is unwell. Since my son's passing, she has displayed instability, erratic behavior. She abandoned the family home, stole property, and now hides under this man's roof. The Holt family seeks rightful guardianship to protect her interests." Murmurs rippled across the benches. Crawford nodded as though he'd already decided. Then his eyes shifted to Rachel. "Mrs. Holt, what say you to these charges?" For a moment, silence threatened to crush her. Her fingers tightened on the shawl, the courtroom swimming with hostile stares. Then she drew breath, her voice cutting through the haze. "I took nothing but my mother's locket," she said, her hand rising instinctively to the small pendant at her throat. "As for abandoning the home, you call it that? They stripped me bare, left me by the creek to die. That is not guardianship, that is cruelty." The room stirred. Women exchanged sharp glances, men shifted uneasily, even Ezekiel dropped his gaze, shame flickering across his face. Jeremiah slammed his palm against the table. "She lies, always been touched in the head, just like her mother. You can't trust a word from her mouth." Rachel did not flinch. "I am not mad. I am not property. I am a woman, and I choose where I live." The judge cleared his throat, sweat gathering at his collar. His gaze darted to Holt, then back to Rachel. He shuffled papers, searching for some path that would appease both sides. Finally, his gavel struck once more. "This matter requires further review. The court will reconvene in 1 month. Until then, the respondent may continue her present arrangement." The words fell like stones. It was no victory, only a stay of execution. Holt's face darkened, the mask of civility slipping as he leaned close to Elias on his way out. "You'll wish you'd buried her in the dirt where you found her." Outside, the sunlight seemed too bright. Elias helped Rachel into the wagon, her hand cold but steady. He said nothing, but inside, something burned hotter than the desert sun. The Holts had shown their hand. Law was no shield. Rachel sat upright, staring straight ahead, voice low but certain. "He will not break me again." And Elias knew, in that moment, he would not let her stand alone. Back at the ranch, the dust of the courthouse still clung to their clothes, but Rachel wasted no time in retreating to silence. Instead, she knelt in the yard, turning earth with her bare hands. The soil was stubborn, heavy with clay, but she worked it patiently, stone by stone. Elias watched from the porch, unsure whether to call it foolish or brave. At last he stepped down, a hoe in hand. Land here's poor, won't grow much. Rachel glanced up, her hair falling loose across her cheek. My mother grew vegetables and worse. She took the tool from him, her grip firm despite the blisters forming. I know how to make things grow. He left her to it, returning later to find neat rows etched across the patch of earth, seeds buried beneath. Small stones marked the boundaries, a gardener's claim staked in the wilderness. For the first time, color would come to this barren yard, if the ground agreed.
That evening, as they shared cornbread and beans, Elias asked quietly, "Where'd you learn all that?" She hesitated, then sipped her coffee before answering, "I taught school before Walter." Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the faint furrows of her new garden gleamed under moonlight. Reading, writing, sums, little ones mostly. I loved it. The admission surprised him. He had imagined her life bounded only by Holt cruelty. Instead, here was a glimpse of who she had been before chains were laid across her. "Why stop?" he asked. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because Walter decided I should. And what Walter decided, the family enforced." Elias said nothing more. But the picture of her, chalk dust on her hands, children at their desks, lodged in his mind like a fragment of light in a darkened room. In the nights that followed, she continued tending the patch. Elias caught himself lingering at the window, watching her silhouette kneel in the soil, patient as prayer. Something stirred in him each time, something he had buried alongside Clara. He fought it, but it grew nonetheless. One morning, as he tightened the cinch on his horse, he spotted riders far off, just shadows against the horizon, moving slow but deliberate. They did not approach, only circled, as if marking territory. A warning. He watched until the dust settled, then returned to the cabin. Rachel was setting seed packets neatly on the table, sorting them with care. She looked up at him, reading the tension in his face before he spoke. "Riders?" she asked. He nodded once, watching. Rachel drew a long breath, then returned to her task. "Then we plant faster." Elias studied her. This woman who had been left to die, who now dared to sow hope in hostile ground. He felt the weight of the storm building around them, but also the strange strength of her presence. The land, the law, the Holts, none of it promised mercy. Yet, as he stood in the doorway, the faint shoots of something new seemed possible. For the first time in 12 years, Elias began to believe that survival was not the same as living. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The smell woke him before the flames did. Not the warm wood smoke scent of a morning fire, but the acrid bite of coal oil carried on the wind. Elias sat bolt upright, lungs already tightening. Outside the window, the sky pulsed orange, too bright for dawn. By the time he burst into the yard, the barn was a tower of fire. Flames clawed at the beams, licking upward until the roof collapsed inward with a groan like a dying beast. Horses screamed inside, hooves thundering against the stalls. The cattle in the pen bellowed, panic rippling through them as sparks scattered across the dust. Rachel stumbled into the yard, hair loose, face pale in the firelight. "The animals!" "Get the buckets!" Elias shouted, already dragging a coat over his head. He plunged toward the barn doors, heat slamming into him like a wall. The first horse fought him, eyes rolling white with terror. But he hauled her out, slapping her flank until she bolted into the night. He went back for the second, lungs burning, vision blurred by smoke. By the third stall, the roof gave way. He staggered back as the rafters crashed, sparks exploding skyward. One horse lost. By dawn, nothing remained but blackened timbers and smoldering ash. Half the winter hay was gone, the wagon destroyed, tools warped and useless. A man could rebuild from many losses, but this struck at the bone of his survival. Elias stood staring at the ruin, chest heaving, eyes raw from smoke. The land he had tamed through sweat and silence had been gutted in a single night, and he knew the hand behind it, the Holts. The fire carried Jeremiah's signature as plain as any brand. Back inside, he packed with mechanical precision. Ammunition, jerky wrapped in cloth, coffee, flint, rifle oiled and ready. His movements carried no hesitation. There were debts now, and he meant to settle them. Rachel found him in the small room, saddlebag open on the bed. She froze in the doorway, her voice brittle. "You're leaving?" Elias didn't look up. "Going to end this." "End it how?" Her tone sharpened. "With bullets? With blood?" "With whatever it takes." He cinched the strap on the bag, jaw locked. "Holt won't stop until we stop him." Rachel stepped into the room, eyes blazing. "And if you kill him, what then? Another brother steps up? Another enemy made? You think violence will end this?" Elias's silence was answer enough. His hand lingered too long on the rifle, as if it had become the only language left to him. Rachel moved closer, her voice low but fierce. "I've already been left for dead once. Don't you do the same to yourself. Don't let them turn you into what they are." For the first time, Elias faltered. His grip on the rifle slackened. Smoke and silence pressed between them, the ruins of the barn still glowing outside. The point of no return had come, not in the fire, but in the choice that stood before him now. The cabin carried a silence thicker than the smoke outside. Elias set the saddlebag on the bed, his jaw clenched hard enough to ache. Rachel said nothing more, only watched him from the doorway, her face pale but unyielding. He reached for the tin cup on the sideboard, meaning only to steady his hands with coffee. His arm brushed against the shelf, and something slipped, porcelain striking the floor with a brittle crack. The sound froze them both. Shards of white scattered across the planks, the last of Clara's teacups splintered into pieces. Elias stared down, chest tight, as though his late wife had died all over again. For 13 years he had guarded that single relic, untouched by time. Now it lay broken at his feet, beyond saving. Rachel dropped to her knees without a word. She gathered the fragments gently, as though handling bone. Elias tried to turn away, but her voice reached him, steady, carrying something stronger than grief. "It's only a cup," she said softly. Then, more firmly, "But it can be mended." From the shelf, she fetched a small pot of glue he kept for harness repairs. Piece by fragile piece, she began fitting the porcelain back together, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hands trembled, but they worked with patient determination, refusing to accept final ruin. Elias watched, torn between disbelief and something else he couldn't name. Why bother? It won't ever be the same. Rachel didn't look up. No. But sometimes broken things, once mended, hold stronger than before. Scars bind tighter than smooth porcelain ever could. The words sank into him like rain on parched soil. He saw not just the teacup, but the reflection of his own life, cracked by loss, held together only by silence. Perhaps even his heart could be pieced back, if someone was willing to try. As the cup took shape again, crooked but whole, Rachel whispered a verse she remembered from her mother's Bible. "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come." 2 Corinthians 5:17. She placed the mended cup on the table, the cracks faint but visible, a map of its breaking. Elias reached out, fingers brushing its surface. For the first time since the barn fire, his shoulders eased, the tight coil of vengeance loosening. Rachel finally looked at him, her eyes steady. "You don't have to carry this fight the way Holt wants you to. Not with rage, not with blood. We mend, we build. That's how we win." Elias closed his hand over the cup, holding its imperfect strength. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the saddlebag aside. The choice had not ended the danger, but for the first time, Elias chose not to be ruled by it. The morning after the fire dawned gray, the smoke from the barn still hanging low across the fields. Elias sat at the table with papers spread before him, a quill gripped awkwardly in his hand. He had not written anything more than a supply order in years. Now each line felt like carving into stone. Rachel stood nearby, her arms wrapped in Clara's shawl. She said nothing, but her presence at his shoulder steadied him. At last, Elias pushed the paper forward, his jaw set. "It's a deed," he said. "Partnership agreement. Land, cabin, what's left of the herd. Half yours, half mine. If Holt tries to claim you again, the law says you're not his kin. You're my partner." Rachel's breath caught, though she masked it quickly. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper, as if afraid to smudge it. "You'd do that for me?" Elias met her eyes. "Not for you alone. For this place. For what we're trying to build." His voice roughened. "Walls keep people out, but they also keep you in. I've been behind mine too long." For a moment, neither moved. Then Rachel picked up the quill. Her hand trembled, but the ink flowed sure as her resolve. She signed her name beside his, 2 lines joined on a page that might outlast them both. When she set the quill down, Elias felt a weight shift. For 12 years, his life had been a solitary ledger, empty of all but loss. Now it bore 2 names, written in the same hand of fate. A knock at the door startled them. Elias reached for the rifle out of habit, but the voice outside was familiar. "It's Sarah," came the shopkeeper's call. "I've brought something." He opened the door to find Sarah Whitfield standing with a bundle of cloth and food. Behind her, Tomas Reyes led his mule, iron tools clinking at the pack saddle. The 2 exchanged a look as they stepped inside, their eyes falling on the signed paper at the table. "So it's true," Sarah murmured, setting down the bundle. "You've tied your names together." Rachel nodded, straightening her shoulders. "We had to." Tomas studied Elias, then gave a short nod. "Good. Paper alone won't stop Holt, but it's a start, and with witnesses, it carries more weight." Sarah unwrapped bread and salt pork, setting them out as though it were Sunday supper. "Then let's make sure the right people see it. Reverend Collins can notarize. Eliza Thornton can spread the word. Holt's not the only one with a tongue in this county." Elias looked from one to the other, a flicker of something new stirring inside him. For years he had held the world at bay. Now the world was walking through his door, uninvited but not unwelcome. Rachel touched the edge of the deed again, her fingers firm. "Then we fight not just with guns or anger, but with truth." Elias nodded slowly, the words anchoring him, truth and witnesses. Outside, the smoke still curled from the ashes. Inside, something stronger than fire had been signed into being. The night was quiet but uneasy, the kind of silence that made even the crickets hold their breath. Elias sat cleaning his rifle by lamplight when a horse's hooves sounded faintly on the trail. He rose, rifle in hand, every muscle tensed. The rider came slow, alone, no weapon drawn. As the figure drew closer, Elias recognized the younger Holt, Jacob. The boy's shoulders slumped, his hat pulled low, shame weighing heavier than the dust on his coat. "That's far enough," Elias called, rifle steady. Jacob reined in, raising both hands from the reins. "I came unarmed, just need to talk." Rachel appeared in the doorway behind Elias, a lantern in her hand. Its glow caught Jacob's face, tired eyes, unshaven jaw, and something rawer than fear. Elias gestured, "Dismount, leave your belt on the saddle." Jacob obeyed, moving carefully. He turned his pockets inside out, showing them empty, an old cavalry trick Elias recognized. When he finally stood before them, the words burst out as though torn from him. "They're planning to burn you out completely, tomorrow night." His voice shook, but the urgency was real. 8 men, Pa, Samuel, Ezekiel, Deputy Morris, 3 hired guns out of Fort Worth. They mean to call it an arrest, but it ain't that. They'll torch what's left and gun you down if you run. Rachel tightened her grip on the lantern. "And why tell us? You stood by when they left me for dead." Jacob's gaze dropped to the dirt. "I know, I did nothing, and I see her face every time I try to sleep." His voice broke. "I can't undo what I didn't stop, but I can tell you this. Pa won't stop till he buries you both, and I won't be part of it anymore." Elias studied him, weighing the boy's shame against the risk of deception. "If you turn on your kin, you know you can't go back." "I know," Jacob said, lifting his eyes at last. They were the same pale gray as his father's, but without the cruelty. "Maybe I don't belong there anymore. Maybe I never did." The three stood in silence, the firelight flickering against the cabin wall. Then Rachel spoke, her voice quieter but stronger than before. "Then tell us everything." Jacob outlined the plan, how the men would come from 3 directions, fire the outbuildings first, drive Elias and Rachel toward the creek where Holt's sons would wait. He drew the map in the dirt with his boot, each line another nail in the coffin of his family's schemes. When he finished, Elias lowered the rifle, though he kept it in hand. "You can't stay here. Holt will smell your absence." "There's a line shack north of the ridge," Jacob said. "I'll wait there. If they move early, I'll ride to warn you." Rachel studied him, her lantern light softening just enough to show she believed him. Elias gave a short nod. "Then go, and know this, your choice tonight may save more than just us." Jacob's throat worked as he swallowed. "Reckon I finally aimed to do one thing right." He mounted, turned his horse north, and vanished into the night. Elias and Rachel stood together, the weight of what was coming pressing down like the smoke still lingering over the ranch. The church stood pale against the night sky, its clapboard walls silvered by moonlight. Elias and Rachel approached quietly, keeping to the shadows of the cemetery. A lantern burned low in the Reverend's study, its glow spilling across stacks of books and a Bible open on his desk. Michael Collins answered the knock with the book in one hand and a revolver in the other. Age had not softened him, his hair silver, his eyes sharp, his voice low but steady. "Elias Marcer," he said, then glanced to Rachel. "And Mrs. Holt, come in quickly." Inside, the air smelled of lamp oil and leather. Elias laid the partnership deed on the desk. "We need it witnessed, and filed where Holt can't touch it." Collins studied the paper, nodding slowly. "This binds you together before the law, but Holt won't care for law. He'll come with fire and steel." Rachel answered before Elias could. "Then let the truth have witnesses." The Reverend's eyes softened. He set aside the revolver, pressed his seal into the hot wax, and signed with a firm hand. Then he bowed his head over the page. "Lord, let no weapon forged against them prosper. Let the truth stand where lies falter." The prayer settled into the room like an anchor. A knock startled them all. Collins moved cautiously to the window, then relaxed. "Sarah Whitfield," he said, opening the door. The shopkeeper bustled in with a basket of bread, cheese, and coffee, her eyes keen. "Figured you'd need this." Behind her came Thomas Reyes, his leather apron dusted with soot, a rifle slung across his back. "And figured you'd need this." Last of all was Eliza Thornton, the postmistress, who carried no weapon but information. "Deputy Morris bought extra ammunition this evening," she reported without preamble. "And the Holts are drinking heavy at Wilkins's saloon, talking loud about finishing what they started." Rachel looked around the small study, the faces gathered close. Shopkeeper, blacksmith, postmistress, preacher. Elias felt the weight of it, a fellowship forged not by kinship but by choice. "You all risk Holt's wrath by standing here," Elias said, voice low. Sarah snorted. "We've lived under Holt's shadow too long. Time someone struck a match." Thomas leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Fear's only power if you keep it to yourself. Share it, and it shrinks." Eliza adjusted her spectacles. "And word will spread. Folks respect witnesses more than threats." Collins placed the sealed deed in a box, locking it with a small iron key. "This land, this partnership, it's lawful now. If Holt strikes again, it won't be family business. It will be murder before God and man." Elias looked to Rachel, who met his gaze without flinching. For the first time, he felt something shift inside him. The heavy solitude of years replaced by a bond, not just with her, but with the circle forming around them.
The night outside was thick with danger, but within those walls, Elias sensed something Holt had never counted on. Not rage, not vengeance. Community. Dawn broke red over the ridge, the light washing the charred ruins of the barn in the same hue as fire. Elias stood on the porch, rifle balanced at his side. Behind him, Rachel waited in the doorway, shawl drawn close, eyes unblinking. They heard the riders before they saw them, the steady drum of hooves, 8 men strong. Jeremiah Holt rode at the center, flanked by Samuel and Ezekiel. Deputy Morris trailed slightly behind, his badge catching the light.
3 strangers followed, hired guns with flat eyes and restless horses. Elias stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. That's far enough. The riders slowed, dust rising around them. Holt's gaze swept the yard, hard as river stone, until it landed on Jacob. The youngest son stood off to Elias's right, hat low but shoulders squared. Holt's mouth curled in disbelief. "Boy, you'd stand with them against your own blood?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I'm standing for what's right, Pa, for once." A murmur rose among the men, unease rippling. Holt masked it with bluster. "This man's taken advantage of your sister-in-law's confused state. We're here by law to bring her back." He gestured to Morris. "Serve the papers." But before the deputy could move, Reverend Collins stepped into view, Bible in hand. "Mrs. Holt is no longer your kin," he declared, voice carrying like a bell. "She is lawful co-owner of this land. I witnessed the deed myself. Any attempt to seize her is trespass, plain and simple." Sarah Whitfield spoke next, sharp as a knife. "And we'll testify to it, every one of us." Thomas Reyes shifted his rifle against his shoulder. "Law doesn't belong to men with the biggest herd. It belongs to truth." Eliza Thornton adjusted her spectacles. "And the mail coach already carries word of this deed to the county seat. Whatever you do here today will be known." Jeremiah Holt's face darkened, fury straining against the leash of pride. He turned to Rachel at last. "Girl, you embarrass yourself. Come home before this farce destroys you." Rachel stepped forward, past Elias, past the line of witnesses. Her voice was calm but steady. "I have a home, here, by my choice. No man decides that for me again." For a moment, silence held. Samuel's hand hovered near his holster, eyes burning. But Jacob moved, blocking his brother's path, his stance unyielding. "No more, Sam, not this time." The hired guns shifted uneasily. They had come for pay, not for a war against preachers, shopkeepers, and neighbors. One tugged his horse back, muttering. Even Deputy Morris looked away, shame in his eyes. The balance tipped. Holt saw it, the crumbling of control, the fracture in his own bloodline. He spat into the dust, venom in every word. "This isn't over, Mercer, not by a long mile." Elias raised his voice, steady as stone. "It is if you set foot on this land again. You come near, we'll have witnesses enough to bury you in your own lies." Holt glared at him, at Rachel, at the circle of townsfolk standing firm. Then, with a sharp tug on the reins, he wheeled his horse. Samuel followed with a curse, Ezekiel with downcast eyes. The hired men drifted after, eager to be gone. Only Jacob remained, shoulders heavy but unbroken. Elias lowered his rifle. Rachel released a breath she hadn't known she held. Around them, the yard slowly eased, the community's presence dissolving the last of the fear. Holt's power had not ended in blood, but in shame, and in witnesses refusing to look away. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. Summer settled over the hills, laying a gentler hand than spring had promised. Where ashes had smoldered weeks before, fresh timber now stood, cut and hauled by neighbors who just happened to have spare boards.
The new barn was taller, straighter, its beams raised not by one man's labor, but by many.
Hammers rang like bells through the long afternoons, each strike undoing a little more of Holt's shadow. Elias had never been good with words, but his silence no longer kept people away. Sarah Whitfield bustled in and out, bringing loaves and strong coffee for the work crews. Tomas Reyes lent his blacksmith strength, setting hinges and braces with the care of a craftsman. Even Eliza Thornton appeared with a ledger, recording who had given what so no debt would be forgotten. "Fair's fair," she said crisply, and Elias found himself almost smiling. Most surprising of all was Jacob Holt. The boy stayed on after the standoff, taking to chores with a kind of grim determination, as though every nail driven and every stall mucked out was penance for the years he had stood silent. Elias gave him no easy grace, but he did not send him away either. Rachel, for her part, offered Jacob quiet kindnesses, a plate at the table, a word of thanks. Trust came slow, but it came. The garden Rachel planted had begun to flourish, coaxed from stubborn soil by her steady hands. Beans curled green along their stakes, squash blossoms opened bright against the earth, and tomato vines reached higher each day. In the evenings, Elias often found her kneeling in the rows, dirt on her palms, a look of peace softening her face. More than once, he lingered in the doorway longer than he meant to, watching her work. One evening, as fireflies rose over the meadow, Elias carried 2 mugs of coffee to the porch. Rachel joined him, brushing soil from her skirt. Between them on the bench sat the mended porcelain cup, faint lines still visible where it had broken. They passed it back and forth in quiet ritual, the cracks no longer marks of ruin, but of endurance. "Sarah says the school board's looking for a teacher," Elias said at last, his voice rough from disuse. Rachel tilted her head, studying him. "And you think I should leave?" He shook his head. "I think maybe you miss it. Doesn't have to be one or the other. School's close enough to ride. 3 days in town, rest here." She smiled faintly, her hand brushing against his on the bench. "And my business partner agrees to that arrangement?" Elias met her eyes. "He does." They sat in companionable silence, the air warm with summer, and something gentler still. For the first time in years, Elias felt more than the weight of survival. He felt the shape of tomorrow. Word of the confrontation had spread through the county, carried on Eliza's tidy reports and the whispers of neighbors who had witnessed it. Folks began to call it the quiet stand, the day Jeremiah Holt was turned back not by gunfire, but by truth and courage. Some said it marked the slow decline of Holt's grip on the land. For Elias, it marked something smaller but no less profound: the day he stopped being alone. On Sundays, when Reverend Collins preached, Elias now sat near the back, Rachel beside him, Jacob sometimes 1 row ahead. The verse Collins had read that night echoed in Elias's mind still. "No weapon forged against you will prevail, and you will refute every tongue that accuses you." It was not a promise of ease, but of endurance. As the congregation sang, Elias's voice remained low, yet for the first time it joined others. His silence had broken, not in words, but in belonging. The horizon no longer seemed a wall, it was an open road. By late August, the ranch no longer smelled of smoke, but of fresh-cut hay and earth newly turned. The rebuilt barn gleamed golden in the evening light, and Rachel's garden spread in neat, thriving rows. Tomatoes ripened heavy on their vines, beans climbed toward the sky, and sunflowers nodded along the fence line like sentinels. Elias stood on the porch, the mended cup in hand. He had begun to think of it not as Clara's relic, but as something else, a reminder that what breaks can be remade, never the same, but stronger for the scars. Rachel joined him, wiping her hands on her apron, dirt smudged across her cheek. "They'll talk about this place," she said quietly, "about the fire, the stand, the garden that grew anyway." "Let them talk," Elias answered, his voice steadier than it once was. "For once, I don't mind being seen." Down by the barn, Jacob worked among the stalls, brushing one of the rescued mares. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though each gesture was a vow. Once he would not meet Elias's eyes. Now he looked up with a nod that carried no shame, only quiet determination. Rachel followed Elias's gaze. He's finding his way. Elias grunted, but there was no hardness in it. Boys put in the work, that counts more than blood. That Sunday, the small church filled with voices stronger than Elias remembered hearing before. Reverend Collins read from the Psalms, "The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all." Rachel's hand brushed Elias's as the words sank deep. Troubles had come, no doubt, and more would follow. But deliverance had come too, not by force of arms, but by standing, by enduring, by refusing to bow. After the service, neighbors lingered in the yard, speaking of crops and weather, but also of the Holts. Rumors spread of debts Jeremiah could no longer pay, of Samuel's drinking, of Ezekiel drifting away from his father's commands. Power once feared had begun to wither in the open air of truth. Back at the ranch, Rachel laid the locket she had carried since her mother's death on the windowsill beside the mended cup. Two tokens, fragile yet enduring, side by side. Elias paused when he saw it, understanding the offering, not surrender, but sharing. That evening, as fireflies stitched the meadow with light, Elias and Rachel sat on the porch again. The horizon glowed faint with sunset, the land stretching wide and generous before them. Rachel spoke first, her tone thoughtful. "I used to think my life ended the night they left me at the creek.
That I was nothing but what they took from me." Elias turned the cup in his hands, watching the fireflies flicker. "And now? Now I think we're more than what we've lost, more than what broke us." She glanced at him, her eyes steady. "We're what we choose to build after." For a long time, Elias said nothing. Then, with a voice low but certain, he answered, "Then let's build." They sat together in the fading light, two lives once marked by silence, now joined in shared purpose. The mended cup passed between them, each sip a quiet covenant. The land, scarred but yielding, lay ready for the harvest. And as the stars wheeled above the Texas sky, Elias Mercer, once a man who measured his days only by silence, finally measured them by something new. Hope planted, faith endured, and the courage to stand. There's something in this tale that reaches beyond the dust of Texas and the feud of one family. Perhaps you, too, have known loss that left silence where laughter used to be. Perhaps you've felt the weight of standing alone until someone offered a hand, a word, a place beside them. The story of Elias and Rachel is not only about survival, it is about the courage to mend what's broken, the faith to believe new life can grow from ashes, and the quiet strength of community that refuses to look away. If these moments stir memories of your own journey, then stay with us, share your thoughts below, and let your story join theirs. And if you believe in keeping alive the spirit of resilience, hope, and faith, follow for more true Wild West stories, tales where silence gives way to song, and broken lives find a way to be whole again.